Welcome, everyone, to Color Commentary. We are your pauper commentators, Michael Petchik and Adrian Gonzalez. How's it going, Adrian?
Wow, it only took 5 tries for you to say that, right?
It's funny because the patrons are going to see that I goofed once, but now I just look like I'm trying to compensate for something.
Wow, the patrons. Yeah, sure.
But how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you? I played Pig Trinket at F&M. Sorry, go ahead.
Did you?
I didn't do very well. That deck's not very good unless you can draw a green source.
Oh, just bricking on that mana?
Yeah, it's whatever. You know what? Magic is for nerds anyway.
Yep. And we're going to sit down for an hour and talk about it.
Nerd.
Let's get the upkeep out of the way, though. So we got a couple of things we talk about here every week. First up is Original Magic Art. They help bring the show to you weekly. They are a super cool store. They have dice bags, playmats, tokens featuring a myriad of art from Magic's history and the history of the world as a whole, and just really solid stuff, really solid people. They're currently on Kickstarter. They have a Kickstarter for Relics of Wizardry, which is these neat little all-metal tokens and counters for use in Magic games. They look really, really sharp. We got sent some preview versions, and they're pretty darn neat. But if you're looking to buy just good old-fashioned paper tokens and you happen to be on their website, you can use the discount code Commontary, spelled as it is in our name and in all caps, and you'll get 5% off your order, and we get a little kickback for that. So not only are you getting cheaper priced, wonderful art tokens, but on top of that, you're helping support this show and bring it to you. Keep the lights on here. Adrian, what do you got for us?
Alternatively, you could go to our patreon.com/color commentary and support us directly. We use that money to help bring you the hot, spicy, fresh content every week. A little spicy meatball here, a little veggie spicy meatball there if you're me. But, check it out. People, I just realized I don't really talk about being a vegetarian a lot. I'm a vegetarian, everyone. Get over it.
I was gonna say, is it still a meatball if it's a no meatball? Is it just a ball?
Then that's just a veg ball.
Gotcha. But yeah, we post episodes early there. You get to listen to the pre-show where we, talk about our personal lives and crap like that. And yeah, check it out.
Whoa, what's it all about?
just coming hot with the references tonight. So our discussion topic today, we're talking about an article that is like, oh God, I just realized
18 years old.
Yeah, I was going to say, this article's old enough to vote.
Yeah, it's Who's the Beatdown by Mike Flores. We've referenced it on the show before. We haven't really ever talked about it, but, we spend a lot of time goofing off and talking about extremely good memes and, talking about the format. And this is really a seminal, I think, what did I say to you earlier, Mike? I said, this is this is really cool.
The art of war for Magic.
Yeah, I knew I made a cool reference. Yeah, that's the art of war for Magic. I mean, yeah, to know your enemy is to win. I've never read the Art of War. But, insert Sun Tzu quote here about knowing your enemy and winning battles, because that's what this freaking article is about, everyone.
Yeah, this is absolute classic, and we're going to have it in the show notes below. But this is, I feel like, must read Magic theory, like, period. Like, I can't think of another, like, and it's not that big an article. Like, this article you could probably like finish in about 5 minutes, but it's so succinctly like puts into words a very core concept to playing Magic better.
Yeah, and in a nutshell, the article is about how you give up wins, or one of the most common mistakes at tournament level Magic is people who misidentify their role in a similar deck versus deck matchup. So our focus today, and sort of the focus of the article, is aggro versus aggro decks. But you can extrapolate that to control versus control, mid-range versus mid-range. It's all about identifying what role you have in a matchup and then how you can leverage that in order to win.
Yeah, and before the show started, we briefly mentioned, like, like the matchup between, like, say, Blue Black Teachings and Stompy. It's very clear who the aggressor is, who the beatdown is, but it's the matchups where decks are attacking along a similar axis where that kind of gets a little more muddled.
Yeah, and so that's really what we wanted to talk about today, is really how this article applies to our format. I think the example we sort of gave was Burn versus Stompy, but as the format gets more linear and more aggressive, which I think it just has, Teachings is no longer really a contender. People are kind of struggling to define what really the big control deck is in the format. It becomes more and more relevant to be able to, in an aggro versus aggro matchups, figure out who is supposed to be the aggressor and who is supposed to be a little bit more controlling. Excuse me. So that's really what sort of spawned this today. We're not doing a deck tech like usual. We just thought we would get a lot of mileage out of this, frankly, extremely old article, but that's still very relevant today.
Yeah. And there's also the fact that, I've talked on the show before about how I am always going to be playing mid-range and control decks for the most part. And, these sorts of discussions, while they're definitely mainly for the audience, you at home, these discussions also do help the two of us sort of codify ideas that sometimes we may be struggling with. And the discussions also help kind of walk through these things, because I feel like a lot of times, like, book learning Magic is great. And, like, reading this article will, if you haven't already, will definitely be a help to you. Sometimes having the discussion out loud, just forcing yourself to think about it more in depth, can also be a very helpful thing. So before we get into, like, how this applies to our format, I do want to touch on a major point that Mike Flores brings up in this, and that's 3 points. So he kind of breaks it down to who has the ability to deal more damage, who has more removal, and who has more permission and card draw. And so he's basically saying that if you have the ability to deal more damage than your opponent, you're usually the aggressor. You're usually the beatdown. If you have more removal or permission or card draw, you're more likely to be playing the role of the control deck, even if you're not the control deck in the matchup. Like, the whole point of this is saying, like, in grindy mid-range mirrors, which one of you is supposed to be trying to get in damage, or in the aggro v aggro matchup, which one of you is supposed to be holding back a little bit more and playing defensively.
Yeah, and I feel like some of these are not so straightforward. So in the Stompy versus Burn matchup, which I think we're just going to keep going back to because they're two decks that attack on similar angles but are still fundamentally different. Burn not playing a lot of creatures. I think in that matchup, and this is maybe where our discussion will really start, I think Burn is the control deck there. Burn has removal, which Stompy does not have, and a well-placed Searing Blaze will really, take that match away from the Stompy player. Unfortunately, and this is the whole thing, right? Burn doesn't really want to spend burn spells on creatures. That's a losing proposition for Burn. But if you have, say, like a Thermo Alchemist established, then you kind of are a little more comfortable doing it. And so you've switched into the control role, even if you are not really a control deck, which is what I think a big part of the article is recognizing when you are a control deck, even if you're not a control deck. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like there's the obvious example of, like, having enchantments like Rancor makes Stompy a fairly resilient list. Like, putting Rancor onto, say, a Young Wolf, and then having it just come back out of the graveyard when they kill it the first time, and also getting back the enchantment that was placed on it, is a very, very good way to help combat removal. But when you're playing Burn, you've got a whole pile of instant speed burn spells that can also be used as removal in this matchup. So while majority of what you're doing is still going to be trying to advance your general game plan of applying burn directly to your opponent's face, if your opponent has a troublesome threat, something that's going to be a real big problem for you, like, say, I think the most obvious example in my mind would be Vault Scourge with a Rancor on it. Like, that is a very big problem for Burn. Like, 3 points of life a turn is basically saying it's basically your opponent getting the ability off of Kira, the blue legendary that counters the first thing that targets one of your creatures every turn. So like I think that's what you're trying to get at, right?
Yes, that's what I was getting at, because Vault Scourge is a problematic threat that burn cannot beat, especially if there's a Resolve Rancor on it.
Yeah. So while burn really doesn't want to spend spells on creatures, it's sometimes in these very aggressive matchups, because like Stompy without any real opposition, which burn is kind of like, burn doesn't have very many road bumps for it to like block with, but it kind of does have to make some defensive plays in that matchup.
Right, exactly. And then especially since its creatures are like 0-3s, then it can afford to block a little and get some extra reach out of the long game, because I think burn wins the long game against Stompy.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Like if Stompy doesn't get the very fast start and burn can kind of lean on resources that Stompy has a hard time with. For example, if Stompy has some hands which kind of need a Quirion Ranger to survive for a while to really get maximum usage out of. Those kind of hands, like if you can, as the burn player, identify when your opponent's kind of struggling on mana and needs a Quirion Ranger to survive, having the ability to remove that creature and move on lets your game plan play out a little bit better.
And that's why I think Legends Lightning Bolt sorcery,
Chain Lightning.
Yeah, I think that's why it's a little bit better than Lava Spike, because it can kill creatures. But that's just one example, right? The burn versus Stompy matchup. But you have to be able to, and that can also change. Like I don't know if burn's the control deck every single time. I just think it has a lot more interaction, and so generally it's going to be it has the removal, right? So it fulfills that criteria.
Now I do think that this actually changes pretty sizably on the play versus on the draw. And this is something we haven't talked about that much on the show, and is something that I don't really see discussed that much in pauper discussions in general.
Draw or play.
Yeah, like if you're on the play as burn in that matchup, I feel like you're probably slightly closer to being the beatdown, just because you do have that extra turn, and that does represent another 3-point life swing.
Right.
Whereas if you're on the draw in that matchup, I feel like you're going to have to be playing a more defensive role, just by nature of your opponent is going to be the one who likely chips in for meaningful damage quicker. So that is something to consider as well. And it's
I can definitely see that. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's not something that's addressed in the article, but again, like this article is old. It's still good. It's just very old and kind of boils stuff down to a very, very large overview level. Now within that matchup, I guess, are there other examples you could give me that you think really help illustrate the idea of having to make the call of when you're the beatdown in a similar matchup, not a mirror perhaps, but like a similar matchup?
Well, I guess the other one that might be a little bit harder to classify is who's the control deck and who's the beatdown in Elves versus like Boggles, or is it really just a matter of who can go faster?
Yeah, I mean, in those sorts of matchups, I have to think that the main defining factor, because I have not played that particular matchup, I have to think that the main defining factor is like Elves has the option of leaving back blockers, and if their opponent stumbles on ways to give their creature evasion, they can really punish that by just having, these little dorky creatures that, unless your opponent can put trample onto their Boggle, they have a really hard time actually punching through for any damage. So
but I just like, those are both decks that lack hard removal. Elves ostensibly has card draw, but I don't know. It's more difficult.
Yeah, and you definitely do get into like examples. Like, I mean, obviously, we're not supposed to really be talking about like mirror matches, but like the Stompy mirror, like you both do your thing. Like you interact a little. But
that's an interesting thing to bring up, because I also think this article applies exactly to mirror matches. I mean, it applies to mirror matches too. where let's say then you have to think about what are the mirror breakers. And so in Stompy, it's the fight spells, I think, and it's especially Vault Scourge.
Yeah, where if you can stick an early Vault Scourge, you're going to, even if you're not like invalidating your opponent's attacks, you're just making them slightly worse. Like being able to chip in once with Vault Scourge and like, I don't know, dropping a Hunger of the Howl pack on it mid combat is in some cases just going to be game.
So I definitely think that, and I think that those require a little bit different because those are based on deck configuration, but I also think those are just based on the cards you've drawn over the course of the game. And I think that is sort of the tough spot where it's maybe even an exact mirror match, and you have to figure out if you were supposed to be playing the less aggressive role or the more aggressive role.
Now, interestingly enough, in the example we've listed here, Vault Scourge, because it has lifelink, serves as both a defensive and offensive card in this matchup because it is helping you pad your life total, which is a defensive thing to do, but it is also still providing you a clock, which is, part of the reason why they're playing that over, say, just a green life gain spell sometimes. I know that in the past, Feed the Clan has been a particularly popular choice for the sideboard of Stompy, but Vault Scourge lets you still sort of continue through your main game plan while still being able to provide this defensive benefit to you. So you don't have to be like, all right, my sideboard has like 5 fight spells in it for the mirror because that way I can be the control. Instead, you're kind of being like, instead of being the control deck, I'm going to be the slightly mid-rangeist version of this. And I mean, in that matchup, you do also have the crossplay of using Vines of the Vastwood both offensively and defensively.
Yeah, Vines of the Vastwood says that the creature cannot be the target of spells your opponent controls. It does not give it hexproof. So if you were to target it in response, if you were to Vines your opponent's creature in response to a Vines, their Vines would not work, which is really funny.
Yeah, and I mean, part of it is like with that specific example, like is Vine, you have to make that judgment call of like, am I better off using Vines to punch in an extra 4 damage at some point? Or am I better off waiting for my opponent to try and resolve something like Rancor, which is going to, again, be a big problem for me, and Vinesing their creature so that way I'm being hit less. And again, I think this relates back to being on the draw versus being on the play because, we've seen time in and time out and time again, like in the challenges, a lot of these Stompy decks are like sitting at like 70 cards out of 75 being exact mirrors. So you kind of need every little percentage point you can get in those because your draws are likely to be of similar quality and similar effect to your opponents. So if you're on the draw, you're functionally a turn behind.
Yeah.
So yeah, I see where you're coming from with applying this to mirror matches as well as non-mirror matches. And I think it would also be good to talk about matchups where neither deck is the aggro deck, so someone has to kind of fill in the role of being the beatdown. Do you want to sort of lean in on this?
I think you should start. Control decks better than I do.
So I would go with the example of back when Teachings was still like a real deck in the format. You kind of had the split between the decks that refuse to win by anything else other than like resolving even cards justice a bunch, and then decks that, in order to be able to play the aggressor in control mirrors, would wind up playing stuff like Gurmag Angler. And we kind of saw this division where we now have the Dimir Alchemy decks, which borrow a little bit from the blue-black Turbo Angler style decks and a little bit from Teachings. So far as in the last challenge, we didn't talk about this one because I don't think I spotted it, but there was a Alchemy deck in the last challenge that straight up ran Teachings in it, which is kind of neat. But you kind of have this version of a deck that is less controlling, more aggressive, and can still play the game where it interacts on the stack, but also has a very real win con in the form of this 5/5 that you can get out there very aggressively. And I think I think being able to, in like teachings mirrors, let's go with that, because even when it was big, there was even still pretty large disparities between teachings lists. It kind of comes down to your card selection, and that kind of touches on deck building. Like when you're building a deck at either end of the spectrum, either a very aggressive or a very controlling deck, you need to think about your card selection and how am I going to interact with similar decks. And you pointed out like having fight spells in your Stompy sideboard lets you interact with other creature-based decks. And, you know, when it comes to control mirrors, it could be saying, I'm going to go a little bit threat heavier because I have counter magic so I can win a counter war on the stack. But I'm going to play some more creatures so that way when I'm up against the other control deck, I can side into more creatures and I can have a faster clock and I can present a more reliable win con. And hopefully that's enough to overpower my opponent. And, you know, I think that's why as the format gets more aggressive, we're starting to see less and less teachings decks because removal's getting worse. And there's also no other dirtily control deck to prey upon, really.
Yeah.
So I think the last thing that we haven't touched on is control decks. And control decks kind of are the only option to ignore this question. Or, sorry, combo decks. Did I say control decks? I meant combo decks.
Yeah, you did. I was like, wait a second. I was like, we just talked about control decks.
No. So combo decks kind of get to ignore this question. Like, I mean, I'm right now grasping to come up with an example in Pauper, but like I'm thinking about like Legacy in the moment, and like the Storm decks in Legacy by and large don't dreadfully interact with the opponent that much. Like you're playing some amount of discard spells to, you know, interact with your opponent and get rid of answers to what you're about to do. But apart from that, like those decks by and large aren't really caring about what the opponent's doing. And I guess, do you feel like that's true with Pauper combo decks?
I would say in the case of a deck like Familiars, that's certainly the case. I think Rallygon does interact with the opponent a little bit more. You have some defensive pieces like that guy you sack and it gives protection from colors. But then if you look at a deck like Familiars, it really only interacts with you at the end when it's trying to kill you with the flickered Denrova Horror, but it doesn't actually run any It doesn't actually run any other interaction. It doesn't run removal. It doesn't run counter spells. So in that case, I would say yes. If you're a combo deck and your opponent is a combo deck, you're trying to see who will combo off first, by and large.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about the one example. So when you're playing a control deck and you come up against a combo deck, your role is you kind of have two options. One is make sure your sideboard is jam packed with ways to interact with how your opponent's comboing. For example, in a black inclusive control deck, if your opponent's on elves, you might side into stuff like Shrivel so that you can counter the fact that it's a creature-based combo deck. Or if your opponent's on, I don't know, let's go with the absurd example, One Land Spy, you might side in some dispels and some other assorted counter magic so that you can interact with them in a meaningful way.
Relic.
Relic as well. But the other thing you can do is also just kind of side in more threats. And going back to the example of something like Alchemy, which is technically more of like a big mid-range style deck, you're gonna, you know, perhaps side in your Stormbound Geist and whatever other assorted creatures you have on the board, because you can also just play the game plan of, all right, I'm going to present a faster clock than I did last time, and hopefully that's enough to get me there. So I think in our format more than others, the who's the beatdown sometimes comes down to your sideboard. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can see that. I think you put it pretty well though. Like I think a lot of it comes down to deck building in that case. Like you said, like what are you prepared to face against? If you're prepared to face the mirror, then you're going to be good in the mirror because you have creatures and they're not able to deal with it very well. So I don't know.
Yeah. So I kind of want to circle back to something you'd mentioned before. And obviously a lot of our listeners play a lot of Magic, but I think I kind of would love to hear you break down for our listeners what you meant earlier when you talked about linear decks. And I think that's something that we see a lot of discussion in formats like Modern, and even to some extent we see it discussed in Legacy. But I would love for you to explain that in a nice way that our listeners at home can be on the same page as us.
So I'm trying to think. So what am I trying to say? Pauper is a format where if your deck is very resilient and your deck is very straightforward, you will do better than a toolbox deck. And that's just because we don't really have a lot of toolboxy style strategies that really work. The best one is Teachings, and we all know where that one is right now. So the format evolves towards this meta where you have these decks like Affinity or Stompy or Burn or Boggles or Elves, which are all trying to do their thing before the other player does their thing. And I think actually this is why we've seen Boros become such a popular and good deck, is because it matches up very well against those strategies. And I actually don't think I think it's an exception to the rule. It's not a linear deck. So yeah, you have these strategies that are basically just trying to race each other.
Yeah, you've kind of got the two ships passing in the night. Like, it's not quite just goldfishing against your opponent until one of you wins, but we're certainly seeing a reduction in ways to interact in a meaningful way, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah, currently, in my opinion, the best way to interact with your opponent is with Lightning Bolt.
Yeah. And that does kind of bring up something that I think is good to talk about. And that's kind of in Pauper, one of our failings, I guess you could say. And one of the reasons why Aggro and, mid-range has kind of pushed control a little bit out of the picture is the versatility of answers versus versatility of threats. Like, there's no real wrong way to play a Burning Tree Emissary as long as you don't just empty cast it into nothing and you had a 2-drop in your hand you could cast. Like, that's obviously a misplay, but there's not really a wrong way to play that. Whereas our removal tends to be a little bit more narrow to the point where control decks are somewhat punished for playing certain types of removal because it's not always going to find a home. Like, edicts are not super great right now. I mean, we kind of hammer that point home, but yeah.
Just a lot of go wide strategies.
So I think that's a super salient point that you brought up, that right now, Lightning Bolt is a super great way to interact with your opponent because it both advances the game plan of your opponent losing the game, but can pull double duty by helping you not lose the game. Like, it's pretty decent at handling a lot of the threats in our format. And I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, we are a format that by and large lacks a meaningful way to 2-for-1 your opponent on a routine basis, I guess is what I'm kind of getting at here. Do you think that's fair?
I would say that's absolutely fair. Our format's largely based off 1-for-1s. The other best card I would say is probably Counterspell for interacting with your opponent. So these are both 1-for-1 trades. And that's the funny thing about Chainers also, right? Chainer's Edict is a 2-for-1. But if all the creatures aren't, what's the word?
Removing a creature isn't always removing a card, I think is what you're trying to get at here.
Yes, because they could just sacrifice something that doesn't matter. And, most of the decks now have lots of sacrifice fodder. Like if you edict away a pair over the course of the game, your edicts eat a pair of 3-man inspectors. I think your opponent came out ahead in that exchange.
Yeah, because each one of those is going to, there's more mana involved, but it will cantrip and replace itself. Like, assuming the game goes long enough for you to pay 2 mana at some point, that card is card neutral. There's no card advantage or disadvantage. So, and if you manage to get to recast it, you're actually in card advantage territory. So, and you know, I can return to the example of Young Wolf. Like, Chainer's Edict versus Young Wolf is the worst rate. Like, you're paying 9 mana to remove what they spent 1 mana on.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, so it's really terrible. So it's obvious that, you know, like you said, it gets rid of a creature, but not necessarily a card.
Yeah, and again, like in Boros tokens, like if your opponent goes Battle Screech and flashes back Battle Screech, Chainer's Edict, at best, you're going to be paying 9 mana to remove half of a card that they spent 4 mana on. So, you know, we don't have a Wrath effect. I'm not arguing we should have Wrath of God, but the fact that, and I think this reaches out into the broader like topic of playing aggro, there's nothing that right now that punishes a player playing Stompy from just playing their hand out. Like, if we had, say, you know, a more affordable version of Even Car's Justice, there would be a real risk in going turn 2, Burning Tree Emissary, Burning Tree Emissary, Burning Tree Emissary, Burning Tree Emissary. Like, obviously, you know, that's the absolute nuts, but like, what do you do to stop that? Like, if your opponent does that, the game has functionally ended in most cases.
I would say it's even, you know, more than that. Like, if they get 2, that's fine. But yeah, there's no real way of punishing the aggro decks. So that's really, I think, why we wanted to talk about aggro today, talk about who's the beatdown. Not only is it a good lesson, but it's also a chance to talk about how aggro-centric the format has become.
And I think that's the real thing. Like, in other formats where there are wraths, like, there is this very key aspect of playing aggro, which is knowing when to hold your threats back, knowing like, I can win off the back of these 4 threats I've played out. I should hold my future threats in case there's something here that punishes me for playing them out.
And I've been an aggro player for forever. I played a lot of aggro in my time. I started off playing Red Deck Wins in a Strahd Ravnica block, and that was a format with Sphinx's Revelation and Supreme Verdict. So you had to be real good about holding your stuff back, skull cracking them when it was time to skull crack, not playing into 4 mana, trying to get there off like Ash Zealot and stuff like that. Like, it was definitely a good crucible, I guess, to learn the ins and outs of that kind of match. But what I'm getting at is, yeah, you're right. Those are lessons learned that don't apply in our format.
Yeah, and that's kind of a bummer because, like, I do think, like, as someone who doesn't touch aggro decks that much, that is one of the skills that I am always impressed by, because it requires a very like astute knowledge of how the game will play out from this point. It's not about answering something it's not about considering what will happen this turn. It's about considering what happens 3-4 turns down the road and saying, like, if these are the only threats I have, can I win the game? Like, finding that razor's edge of like, this will be enough to win me the game, but I'm also not over committing to the point where mass removal just blows me out.
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah. And it's one that I kind of wish we had back in Pauper more. And I think I think the rise of these very linear and very powerful strategies, like what we're seeing the current builds of Stompy looking like, is in the long run, I think, encouraging a style of playing aggro decks that is not less effective, but less nuanced. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I don't have to like, so look, in a format where 1-for-1ing your opponent is the best thing you can do, Burning Tree Emissary is, you know, I guess it's a woman goddess like, because you have 2 cards and they only have 1 removal spell, you know, or they have to place 2 removal spells. I don't know. It's just so good because you can get so far ahead off of only 2 mana, and then they have to spend their turn killing your stuff. So I think that's really why it's really taken a run away with the format. And I don't think it's a bad thing yet. I think we talked about it in previous episodes. It's still fine. But I agree with you where because there's no way to punish using Burning Tree Emissary effectively. Where was I going with this? I feel like
There's no way to effectively punish that play, so there's no reason not to. It's there's no one there telling you to like you're a child, you're home alone, there's a big box of cake, your parents aren't home, and there's no babysitter. There's nothing to stop you from eating that cake because you want to. It's it's all carrot, no stick. The most punished I can imagine you getting is like if your opponent happens to have echoing decay.
And I do think the format is in a really good place. Just so everyone knows, I think the format's fine.
Yeah.
Talking a little theory here. Talking a little theory.
Yeah. I guess I'm kind of like lamenting for a format where there's more nuance in one of the key like super archetypes, aggro being the one in question. And looking at a list for Stompy now, like by and large, it feels a lot like it's trying to just go as fast as it can. It's kind of trying to be burn with a creature plan.
Well, and it works, right? It works because we don't have a lot of these control decks. We just talked about burn as a control deck, but whatever. It works,
Yeah.
So power to it.
Yeah, it's just this kind of awkward position of like, I wish things were better, but also things aren't like massively unhealthy to the point where there should be bans or anything. I think the format is healthy. The catch is we're kind of seeing this turning point of Pauper continually gets better and better questions and doesn't always get better and better answers. Like, I can't think of I'm desperately racking my brain for the last like relevant removal spell that we had pushed into the format, and I am utterly failing to come up with anything. Like, I think the closest thing to a control card we've gotten in the better part of 2 years is Pulsa Barasa.
That's such a good card, though. That's a card. Nah, that's a card.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I brought it up in passing, but that's another example of something that, helps a very, very specific game plan, but, isn't always enough anymore. Just the ability for Stompy to sort of out of nowhere continually build up this army of hyper efficient creatures really makes it so control decks like Marasatron have to just kind of hit a wall of removal that lines up very well. And I think that also speaks to why we're seeing so much success with Boros, because Boros fundamentally almost all of its removal is 1 mana, and it's got some 2 mana removal, and it can just interact so favorably. Like being able to go, okay, my opponent, like there's that chance when your opponent goes to resolve a Rancor that you can actually hit that thing with a bolt and 2 for 1 your opponent, and that is huge game in Pauper. I think that's like the big thing. Like any point where you can leverage your opponent being down mana or down cards on an interaction is bigger than it ever was before.
Pretty good. It's not bad. Not bad at all.
So I guess you, as the aggro player out of this podcast, we've discussed, the fact that there's not really much that punishes going wide in the early game. What would you kind of establish as some guidelines for playing aggro in the format as it stands right now, where you're seeing a lot of aggro decks? What sort of things do you think are big points that players should take home and sort of focus on if they're looking to get better at playing aggro decks?
1, play Stompy. Stompy's the best aggro deck in the format. Because of Burning Tree Emissary, because of how resilient the deck is. I think it's way better than Burn for what it's worth. I think the second thing is, I think a big thing people forget about aggro decks, proper sequencing. And some of them are obvious, Burning Tree Emissary before another 2-drop, but some of them are less obvious. What order do I play my threats in? On what turn do I want to be doing what is a relevant threat in this matchup and what isn't? I think sequencing and identifying which of your threats are strong in a given situation is key for any aggro player, and you have the luxury of not having to worry about mass removal. So I think that's very important, maybe less important than, not because you eventually want to play all your threats anyway. Like maybe it's less important than trying to do proper sequencing and being like, well, what do I have left over after they clear everything out? But I still think that is a big part of it. Another big thing is knowing when to attack and when not to attack, and that sounds like a no-brainer too. But I've seen some pretty lousy attacks in my time. So I think that's a big one.
Yeah. So I think something that would be good is kind of expanding more on like the sequencing thing. And I mean, there are some ones that are a little bit more involved, but still kind of obvious. Like, for example, I'm thinking through the Stompy example. If I'm on the play in a game against an unknown opponent and I have Young Wolf and Kyrian Ranger, both of those are fairly important to my game plan probably, but I feel like almost every time I think the turn one play has got to be Young Wolf, right?
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that because you don't want to get your first threat blown out by like a bolt or something. And a Kyrian Ranger. You said Kyrian Ranger? Yeah, you did. A Kyrian Ranger might be the key to you playing a forest on another turn. You can play the Kyrian Ranger, bounce the forest back to your hand, and then replay the forest. So I would say definitely, and that's another good example of sequencing, is playing the Kyrian Ranger before you make a land drop. I would definitely say that the Young Wolf is the correct choice there. It represents more damage. It's more resilient. Over the course of the game, it represents more damage. The Young Wolf is going to attack more over the course of the game. The Kyrian Ranger is, in my opinion. So,
yeah, and I guess another thing would be like, if you're looking at the Stompy threats, which ones are kind of the ones that sort of peak at turn one, and which ones are the ones where you're like, I'm going to hold this back a little bit more and sort of wait for an opportunity where this card fits in well.
Well, so the thing about Young Wolf is I think Young Wolf is good any turn of the game. It's obviously best on turn one when it has the most opportunities to die. But a turn one Young Wolf is nothing to sneeze at. But, turn 4 Young Wolf is also nothing to sneeze at. If we're talking specifically about Stompy, I would say turn 1 Young Wolf into turn 2 Rancor might be my favorite play. But Rancor is a card that's definitely good where you play it in the game.
Yeah, I mean, except playing it into open mana is always kind of dicey, but you can sometimes afford to take that risk. I think Rancor is really one of the linchpins of that deck, just because your creatures do sometimes get outclassed if you don't have a super fast hand, and Rancor just represents this. I'm going to say something that you're going to hate. Rancor is the punishing fire of Pauper.
I do hate that. Why did you say that? It goes back to your hand. It goes back to your hand.
Well, no. So what I'm trying to get at here is it represents a win con that gets around your opponent trying to interact with it a lot of the time. It's not a perfect metaphor here, but I mean, would you play a 1 mana 2/2 with trample that when it dies it returns to your hand?
Yes.
Like that's kind of what Rancor represents in this deck, because you're running such a heavy amount of creatures. The games where you don't have a target for Rancor were probably not going great for you anyway. So I really think that is the linchpin of the deck. Like everything else contributes to it. Like Kyrian Ranger lets you cut a few forests. Nettle Sentinel is a super aggressive turn one play. But I think when you boil it down, like the hands where Stompy has Rancor in its opening 7, I think are probably the ones it's most likely to win just across the board. Am I being a complete idiot here, or
no? You're being exactly right. Rancor is the best threat the deck has.
Yeah, just the fact that it is constantly recurring, and it is like there are ways to interact with it. It's not unbeatable, but it is much more difficult to interact with that in a meaningful way. Like, look at Boggles, the only other deck I can think of that plays a bunch of auras. Like, one edict can kind of topple that little house of cards very quickly, whereas Rancor is the one that keeps coming back. Like, you have to either remove the creature in response to it being targeted by Rancor or counter the Rancor. Those are the two options, period. So I think that very much is the linchpin. But so you talked about sequencing and you talked about attacking at the right time. And I guess I'd kind of like to hear more of your opinion on sort of analyzing situations like that and how you approach them. And I know that's a huge ask. I basically was just like, so Adrian, how do you play Stompy in every possible matchup with every single board state? But I'm looking for big picture stuff here. It doesn't have to be specifically Stompy, but kind of talking about when the right time to attack when you are the aggressor is.
Definitely when you have pump spells in your hand. But even then, there's still, if you still want to kind of poke your opponent a little, because they should always be playing around pump spells in your hand. If they're not, then you're in trouble because they're probably just going to kill everything. Or I don't know, maybe you'll pump it, but I think that's pretty key.
And especially with the pump spells, like, is it better to hold on to them until they're lethal, or I don't know. I'm kind of spitballing.
When I play Stompy, I am fine using my pump spells as removal.
As removal, okay. And
so meaning you attack, and they block, and you use the pump spell.
And I guess the question here is, I can see this being relevant against, say, Affinity, where they've got a lot of 4/4s, and being able to take one of those out represents one less thing that's going to just keep eating your creatures. So is that kind of the matchup you're thinking of? Because I can't imagine it feels super great to, kick a Vines of the Vastwood to win, like, mirror combat, like a 2/2 versus a 2/2.
No, you're absolutely right. It's to eat creatures that are bigger than your creatures so that you can punch through on later turns. I think another big thing about if you were 100% the aggressor, like, that to me would mean my creatures don't matter. My resources are much higher than my opponents. Then you can start making like you want to trade, basically. You want to remain in control of the board.
Yeah, like the whole, like, as long as I have one more creature than you do, and I'm not just abyssing myself every turn, I will get there eventually. Kind of affair.
And there are situations where you do want to abyss yourself every turn. Kind of. I mean, it depends how close you are to winning. I guess how many pump spells you have. But because a one pump spell can easily win you the game with Stompy if you have one unblocked attacker. So that's another reason, I guess, to maybe hold on to it. But you want to make sure that you are the one in control of the board so that they can never really get off the back foot against you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you want to keep applying pressure to people, and I think that's another good topic to, like, kind of talk about here is applying pressure to someone. And, like, I think that's a very basic sort of thing that most people kind of get the idea of, where it's presenting. If you don't ask a question of your opponent, eventually they're going to start asking questions of their own. Like,
I think a lot of this stuff people do know intuitively, but it does help to, like, explain it in real words.
Yeah, it's sticking a threat that has a credible reason to merit being removed. Like, and token decks sort of prey on this, where, like, removal is bad against token decks because all the threats are equally likely to kill you. And with Stompy, it's kind of like making sure that all of your creatures are big enough that no matter which one your opponent tries to take care of, you're trying to present your opponent with no good options here, and continually attacking, making sure that you keep swinging in for damage so that your opponent has to actively engage with you, because your creatures are going to fare better than their removal, as we discussed. Like, if you're beating in on your opponent with a young wolf, like, your opponent might have to remove it. It's not going to be good for them, but you're kind of forcing their hand on that issue. So yeah, pressure is key in a lot of these aggro decks, and just being able to continually assert yourself as a threat within the matchup. If your opponent can stabilize and make it so that, you know, they're not just dead on board and they can actually interact with your creatures in a meaningful way, that's the point where these decks kind of start losing, because they're no longer actively affecting the game. They're just kind of doing their thing and not really advancing their game plan.
Yeah.
So I guess, is there anything else that you think is sort of really key for someone who's just either starting out in Magic or just starting out in Pauper, and they should really consider when they're playing their aggro decks that, you know, really is like the level up?
The big thing, play careful. Like, don't just be reckless, but don't play scared. I think playing scared is the worst thing you can do as an aggro deck.
Okay, and what do you mean by playing scared? Like, could you give us an example here?
Like, don't be afraid that, you know, you're playing Pauper, probably, hopefully, so you don't have to worry about board wipes. So that's a big scare you don't have to worry about. Your opponent's not going to just randomly clear everything off the table. But I guess I mean, like, if they have blue up and you have 2 threats, play one of your threats. Play the one that matters less, sure. Play careful, play around counterspell, but don't be like, I can't play anything, my opponent has counterspell up. They might not have counterspell, they might be bluffing you. And if they do counter a threat, then you have another threat that they can't counterspell, and you're up in that exchange, in my opinion. So it's just, you know, be careful, don't be an idiot, but don't hold. I don't know. I'm struggling to really explain what playing scared means. I think it just means being too conservative. Don't play too conservatively. You're an aggressive deck. The longer the game goes on, the worse your chances of winning normally are.
There you go. That's I think that's a great way to sum it up, is just, you know, each turn that passes without you getting closer to winning is getting closer to you losing. Like,
yeah, it's a bad turn.
Yeah. If you're the aggro deck, you want to be advancing your game state at your game plan at all times. And it's one of those things that is a skill that I respect a whole lot, because I'm terrible at it. But I think it really is one of the keys, is figuring out the best way to make sure that you are not just playing into obvious stuff and getting completely wrecked, but also not like don't play into obvious things that are going to ruin your day, but also not, you know, assuming that, like, the example you provided, I think, is great. The counter spell, your opponent has blue up, they almost definitely have a counter spell, and you have 2 things you can do this turn. Just do both of them. One of them's going to get through, and as long as those plays were both good and you don't care about both having to resolve, you're in a great state. And I think
yeah.
There's dicier examples where, you know, you need 2 things to resolve and your opponent has blue up, but those are things that, you know, we've given you an overview. You're going to have to go out in the field and actually apply what we've talked about here.
There's something to be said for, if I don't play these 2 things, I will lose. My opponent is representing counterspell. What do I do? Maybe it's just time to go ahead and do it. I don't know. Maybe I'm a little too rash, but
no. I mean, you're the aggro. Like the question on this podcast of who's the beatdown, it's always Adrian. It's never me. So I think that is, like, really solid advice. And, you know, maybe I'll break out some aggro decks online and fiddle around with them, but, you know, very much not my cup of tea. So I think we're getting pretty close here to our hour of fun here. I guess, do you have anything else that you want to touch on in this episode about, you know, turning creatures sideways as Richard Garfield intended?
Bolt's the best out of the boon cycle. I said it.
Ooh, wow. That is the most searing of hot takes, and I am sure we're gonna get some opinions about that.
Hey man, there's only one format you can play Recall in. Come on. Bolt's better.
Is Recall actually banned in Commander? I don't know. I have to assume it is, even though I don't think it's like the most powerful thing you could do in that format. But
I'm looking it up.
Because you can play it in Vintage, and I think that's it for like the major supported formats.
Oh yeah, it's banned.
What about Dark Ritual though? If we're going to talk about the boons, what about Dark Ritual?
Dark Ritual's terrible, and pauper. Aggro is a terrible card.
Okay, fair.
I'm kidding, everyone.
Yeah,
Dark Ritual is good. I think obviously Ancestral. Obviously, Recall's the best card in the boon cycle. Yeah. Obviously, Healing Salve is the best card in the boon cycle.
Oh God, we're just really trying to tilt people here. I think it's interesting though that Giant Growth definitely just the most okay of the boon cycle. Like
it's very middling. It's not terrible like Healing Salve. It's not great like Bolt. It's not amazing like Recall.
It's just fine. Like,
did you know that the original text on Recall said or force your opponent to draw 3 cards?
Yes. Well, I mean, I can guarantee you that if anyone who listens to this podcast plays Vintage, someone is going to have a story about milling out their opponent at instant speed with a Recall. I'm sure it has happened.
Me too.
All right. Do you want to take us out of the show?
Yeah, that sounds like a capital idea, Michael.
All right, go for it, man.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. This podcast is brought to you by the support of our patrons. Please consider supporting us if you like the show. Check below this video or the description of this podcast for details on where to find us. We do have a website. We like to remind you for listening to this on a platform with reviews. They're always appreciated because they boost our visibility. If you've got a deck list or idea for a topic, feel free to contact us either via our website, which has a spiffy contact form, or directly at colorcommentary@gmail.com. Special thanks to Pat's Game and the one and the only L for the use of his song Quantitative as our theme song. Until next week, this is Adrian and Mike, and we are signing off for Color Commentary.